And so we're going to begin with lesson 9, and we're going to talk about the zenith of power of the Judah Maccabean um, territory. And so, just to give a recap, last week we talked about Aristobulus, and Aristobulus was the son of John Hyrcanus, who only ruled for a year, but was able to expand the borders of the kingdom by conquering Galilee. So this is the land that he inherited. And we talked about last week how he only reigned for 1 year, but during that 1 year, his brother took an army up and conquered Galilee, which was able to extend the land to just about its largest portion that it had been since the days of Solomon. So he had killed his mother, he had imprisoned his three younger brothers, he had killed his second oldest brother, and then he died. And so after he died, his wife, his widow, whose name was Salome Alexander, freed his three younger brothers who were in prison, and she married the oldest living brother, and he was 22 years old. And so she frees and marries Aristobulus's brother, Alexander Janus, and becomes the king. He becomes the king and the high priest. This was actually a violation of the Levitical law. And so here is a coin or a depiction of him on a coin. And so that is Alexander Janus. And so he's going to rule for a long time. He's going to be one of the longest reigning kings in this time period for the nation of Israel. And so he comes to power in his early 20s. He's about 22 years old, and he marries the queen, his older brother, Aristobulus's widow, Salome. And this is a violation of the law because Leviticus 21, 13 through 15 says a high priest has to marry a virgin. He cannot marry a widow. And so he marries his brother's widow, and he takes, like his brother before him, the mantle of king and high priest. And so he calls himself the king and he calls himself the high priest, obviously, like his older brother, Aristobulus. Now, Aristobulus was only the king for 1 year, but Alexander is going to be the king for roughly 27 years. Just like his older brother, Alexander Janus does not care about the Levitical law. You can tell that because his very first act as becoming, king by marrying the widow of his brother is to actually violate the law. And so that's pretty much the attitude he has throughout his entire reign. He sees himself as a Hellenistic king ruling over a Hellenistic kingdom. And so he is irreverent towards Jewish religion. He's wicked and ruthless. He will kill a Jewish citizen just as quick as he will a Gentile. It makes no difference to him. And so throughout the course of his 27-year reign from 103 to 76 BC, he's pretty much going to fight battles and wage wars the entire time. And so he was a ruthless warrior, and he was also a ruthless warlord, if you will. And so if you can see here on this map, this is the green aspect is what he inherited at the death of Aristobulus. And so you see the green that is there. Obviously, the purple represents the land that was conquered during his reign. And so with these conquests, here you can see maybe a little bit more on this map. But with the land that Alexander Janus takes over during his lifetime, this is the largest amount of land that the Israelites ever owned. I mean, this is more than Joshua. This is more than David. This is more than Solomon. This is the largest territory the Jewish nation ever controls. Is this right here? And so that's why it's called the zenith of power. So he reigns for 27 years. He has absolute rule, and he rules the largest territory that any king of Israel or Judah has ever seen. And so pretty important figure in the history of the Jewish people. And so terrible guy, but you got to give him some credit for establishing his territory the way that he does. One incident that is famous during his reign is the revolt at the Feast of Tabernacle. Now, the Feast of Tabernacle is one of the three main pilgrimage festivals where all Jewish men are supposed to present themselves before the Lord at the tabernacle in Leviticus 23, 33 through 44, but eventually becomes the temple. Jesus himself observed this. We can see in John 7 through 10. We're told by Josephus and other historians that the city of Jerusalem would swell with travelers, as much as over 100,000. And some of the things they commonly brought with them were palm leaves and citrons, which are kind of like lemons. They're a little bit larger and a little bit bumpier. And so there you can see that they grow plentiful in the region. And so they would bring palm leaves, and they would also bring these kind of larger, bumpy melons. And so Alexander is not only the king, he's also the high priest. And there are certain functions the high priest has to do during these rituals. One of these rituals is he needs to pour holy water on top of the altar. Right? It's the idea of ceremonial cleansing. It's one of the jobs the high priest has to do. And so he goes to this big show. His heart's not really in it. And instead of pouring the holy water on the altar, he pours it on the ground at his feet. Well, obviously, Alexander may not have very much reverence for the Jewish law, but the people do. In fact, this is a time when the Pharisees are starting to grow. The Pharisees are very anti-Alexander. Remember, the Pharisees are more conservative. They're more traditional. They are more, we need to do things exactly by the book, right? And so they don't like Janus Alexander. They don't really care for him at all. And they've let that be known. And they're kind of growing in power, right? Because he's a very divisive figure. There's a lot of people who like Alexander. A lot of people don't like him, right? He just kind of rules through fear and violence. And so when he does this, the people become enraged, and they take these large bumpy lemons basically and start chucking it at him, right? And so they start kind of, losing their minds and start chucking these citrons at him. And so he sends out the army. And he kills 6,000 people. So I mean, there's 500,000 people probably in the city, but still, I mean, he sends out an army of Jews and Greeks and kills 6,000 people inside the city, and so it's a huge event. And so after this takes place, the Pharisees basically try to raise an insurrection. I mean, they've put up with him for years. They don't like him, but this is a bridge too far. I mean, this is too much. And so the Pharisees actually send a correspondence to the king of the Seleucids. Now, the Seleucids are no longer an empire. I mean, they have lost lands and hemorrhaged lands left and right, but they still have a kingdom in Syria, centered in Antioch. They've lost all their territory in the Far East. The Parthians already have that. They've lost all their territory in Anatolia, right? The Greek kingdoms have already split off from there. But I mean, they're larger than Israel. I mean, they have more money, larger army. So the Pharisees say, look, if you'll send an army to get rid of Alexander Janus, we've got the support of the people. Like, we'll back you. We'll help open the gates whenever you get here. And so Demetrius the third, he sends an army. He invades, and he wins the initial battle, and things are looking really good for the Pharisees. This is going to work. But unfortunately, there's a coup attempt back in Antioch. I mean, the Seleucids can't help themselves. I mean, they just coup attempts, civil wars over and over again. And so he's got to go back to Antioch. And so Alexander can take a sigh of relief, and he finds out that the Pharisees are the ones who invited Demetrius and plotted against him. And so how do you think, Alexander is going to feel about the Pharisees? A group of people that he hates anyways. I mean, this is somebody who views himself as a Greek king, acts like a Greek. He doesn't care for the Pharisees. They stand in direct opposition of each other. And so what he does is he goes and he rounds up the 800 leading Pharisee leaders, and he has them crucified. But before they're crucified, or while they're crucified, now crucifixion is not meant to kill somebody quickly. In fact, Jesus is beaten so violently before his crucifixion, he dies very quickly, compared to most people who are crucified. That's what Pilate's kind of surprised. You go back and you read the Gospels, Pilate's kind of surprised Jesus is dead so quickly, because most of the time in crucifixion, you'd actually hang there for days. Jesus hangs there for hours. So he crucifies 800 Pharisees, and while they're hanging there on their crosses, he brings out their wives and their children and kills them in front of the men while they're dying, hanging on the cross, basically. And so 800 individuals are crucified, and nearly 50,000 people are killed during this insurrection. And so, I mean, that's nearly 15 to 20 times the amount of people killed in 9/11. So I mean, it's a large number of people who were killed during this insurrection. And so Josephus records this, and also this is recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have reference, there's about, I think, 650 Dead Sea Scrolls, 250 Old Testament texts. The other are other writings. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it actually talks about this insurrection that takes place. And so the Pharisees are growing in their power, because people are reactionary. You've got a really wicked king who's pro-Gentile, anti the old law. You're going to have kind of this swelling, right? But then all of a sudden, these Pharisees who are growing in power, they are massively persecuted. I mean, just immensely persecuted. They're not rulers at this stage, right? They've never had real strong political power, but they're growing with people. And so during his 30-year reign of almost constant warfare with the kingdoms around him and territorial lines shifting all the time, but overall the kingdom increased under Alexander's reign, and now they controlled more territory than any time in their history. But he's going to die at the age of 49, and so he's going to rule for 27 years, and he's going to die in 76 BC. Reportedly, after being sick for 3 years, Josephus suggests because of his heavy drinking. We don't know if that's true or not, but that's just what he says. And so, but when he dies, he does something really interesting. He leaves his wife, Salome Alexandra, in charge to rule. She is one of the only women to ever rule over Israel and Judah. And so he told his wife that she needed to make peace with the Pharisees. And so after his persecution of the Pharisees continue to grow in power, right? So it kind of has the opposite effect. So because now the Pharisees are seen as the freedom fighters, the Pharisees are seen as the guys who were standing up to the evil man, right? And so they already had this kind of swell of support from the lower classes, which was more religiously inclined. And now they've really proven themselves to be these great, arbiters of the faith who have sacrificed themselves, all these things. Interestingly enough, Salome is actually related to two of the most powerful Pharisees who are still living. And so under her reign, you see a total shift. She actually expels the Sadducees from Jerusalem and actually brings the Pharisees in and actually turns the Sanhedrin in from being a Sadducee-controlled group to actually now where it's Pharisee dominated. This huge shift, right? So this is one of the reasons why when Jesus is born, the Pharisees come to power. And also, this is around 79, 75, right? When Jesus is crucified in 30, they've been in power for about 100 years, and they don't want to lose it. Because the last time they lost power, what happened? About 1,000 of them got crucified, another 50,000 got killed. And so you can see the motivation when Jesus comes on the scene. They're not giving their power up, right? They've had it for 3 generations, and it ain't going anywhere. And so Salome's brother and father were very respected Pharisee leaders. And so the Pharisees accepted her, and they gave her rule very much support. And Salome was also a really good political tactician. And so the Pharisees were very, very upset with her husband, who's now dead. And they've continued to grow in influence and power. And now she's been left the throne. The kingdoms that are around her are not going to accept her or like her. So she needs some political backing. So now, instead of the king / queen being viewed as the persecutor of the Pharisees, this large growing group of people in the area, now she becomes their savior, right? And so they pledge their fealty to her. So the Pharisees actually go from being a persecuted group to a group that actually helps to give her legitimacy and power, if that makes sense. And so she plays that very well. This is a depiction of Salome. Okay, she rules from 76 to 67 BC. Originally, she'd been married to Aristobulus, who ruled for only 1 year. And then she was married to Alexander Janus for 27 years. And so she rules in some way, either as queen of the king or the queen who is the ruler for over 35 years. And so she's a huge figure. Um, Historiographers tell us that she was smart, that she was calculated, that she was politically savvy, believed to have been, as I said before, the daughter and sister of two of the most prominent Pharisees in that time. The Pharisees were growing more and more powerful and had emerged as the dominant religious authority and group by the time she started her reign. She is the first and last queen of Judea, and she actually hid Alexander's death from the public until his military campaign had actually ended. And so she's one of the only two female rulers of Judah and Israel. Athaliah is not mentioned very well. She's a daughter of Ahab. And so let's see here. She installed her son. She can't be the high priest, obviously, but she installed her son, Hyrcanus II, as the high priest. And Hyrcanus II was her elder son. We're told that he was a quiet man that had no political ambition. And so she picks her favorite son and her eldest son, Hyrcanus II, to be the high priest. And her other son, Aristobulus, resented his mother and prepared for an eventual takeover of the kingdom. And so oldest son Hyrcanus gets the high priesthood, but he's not really, a very politically ambitious man. He's happy for his mom to be queen. That's why you don't know. Aristobulus is named high priest, and his mom is the queen. And what happens to her? He puts her in prison and starves her to death, right? John Hyrcanus II has become the high priest, and what does he do to mom? Nothing. I mean, like he's happy. He doesn't mind not being the one in charge. And so for 9 years, mom is the top political whatever, and he doesn't care. He's fine. He's got no qualms with mom being the leader. Aristobulus, the other son, it's kind of interesting that his name is Aristobulus II, and he's just like Aristobulus I, right? And so he bides his time for about 8 or 9 years, resenting his mom, trying to grow and influence and to bring people to his side. And as soon as his mom dies, he's going to launch a civil war that's basically going to bring them the Hasmonean dynasty to an end. But that's for next week. And so, as I said before, Salome expels the Sadducees from Jerusalem. She reinstalled and reorganized the Sanhedrin with nearly all Pharisee appointments, and it became the Supreme Court for the justice and religious matters. The Pharisees would continue to grow in power and influence, becoming the largest sectarian group in Judaism. So you have different groups: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Hasmoneans, the Essenes. But the largest of all these is the Pharisees. They become the largest and the most influential. And so they were the real power of the kingdom. And it's the only form of Judaism that survives. And so after 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. Pharisaic Judaism is the only group of Jews that survive. It becomes known as rabbinical Judaism, but it's basically just the Pharisees, right? It's their descendants. And so the reign of Salome was extremely important because it cemented the Pharisees' power and influence over Judaism, something that we see at the forefront of the Gospels accounts. Supposedly, the reign of Salome was the best of times. It was a time where there were no wars with anybody else. All the surrounding kingdoms were pretty much on their last legs before the Romans came in. And so supposedly during her reign of about 9 years was the most prosperous and peaceful time during this whole from 167. She dies in 67. So it's 100 years. So the revolt with Matthias and his sons began in 167, and she dies in 67. So this is, 100 years. And these last 9 to 10 years that she lives is the best, right? She puts the Pharisees, very religious and staunch, back in power. So it goes from being led by this, rogue Gentile-like king who's a terrible person to now the Pharisees are in control. Everything is run as a theocracy. There's justice and there's this legal code and there's all this stuff. There's no wars. There's no, fighting. There's no foreign encroachments. Everything's nice. And so the people mourned her death. According to rabbinical sources, it says this about her reign. It says that during her rule, as a reward for her piety, rain only fell on Friday nights, says the Sabbath. So the working class suffered no loss of pay through the rain falling during their work time. The fertility of the soil was so great that the grains of wheat grew as large as kidney beans, oats as large as olives, and lentils as large as gold denarii. The sages collected specimens of these grains and preserved them to show future generations the rewards of obeying the law and what piety could achieve. Now, dear class, what do you think? Do you think that those things really happened? Do you think for 9 years it only rained on Friday nights so people's work schedules wouldn't be interrupted? Do you think that the crops grew to, sizes that are not seen in biology?
Strange.
I wasn't there. I don't know. Maybe. But if it didn't, let's just say it didn't. I don't want to call anybody a liar, but let's just say that didn't happen. Why would they write that?
Make her seem better than what she was.
Okay. To make her seem really good. Why?
Pharisees.
Yeah. Luke Elrod hit it right on the head. Who's writing these things in the rabbinical tradition? The Pharisees. Who gave Pharisees their power? She did, right? And so, that's you scratch my back, I scratch yours, right? So she takes the Pharisees. Now think about this. Her husband took 800 of the Pharisee leaders and crucified them and slit the throats of their wives and children as they're bleeding to death on a cross, and then killed 50,000 of their followers. And then she comes in and bans the Sadducees, removes them out of town, bring the Pharisees in, tells them that she's sorry, puts them in the Sanhedrin, and lets them basically run the show. She's the best. I mean, she's great in their eyes. So whenever you see these rabbinical writings about Salome and what she did, you get stuff like that, right? Because, she's one of the main reasons why they're in power. And I mean, they were growing in power. They probably were eventually going to assert themselves as the dominant force in Judaism. But I mean, she definitely, uh, helps them out in that sense. But she's known as great and pious. She has two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, who would soon wage war for control of the kingdom after her death, which would eventually lead to the loss of their independence. And so at this time, after her 9-year reign, I mean, they're looking really good. I mean, you go back to this map here and think about this. When Salome dies, she rules more territory than David ever did. She rules more. So if you want to say, who is the king or queen, who is the regent that rules over more land than anybody? She was.
That one spot down there that's white, stays white.
Ascalon.
I can't see from there. Why
Yeah.
did they never burn that on?
Seaport, really strong walls. And there, I mean, to be honest, there may have been some type of treaty. I mean, I don't know.
Out before that, but it showed the same thing.
Yeah. And so Ascalon was one of the cities that just had, they were they were a great trade post. So maybe there was some type of treaty where they paid. I mean, I don't know. It's a great point, but maybe
Philistine.
it is.
Stronghold.
It is. And so, yeah, you can see these Philistine cities right here. Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza, right, are some of the ones that are mentioned a lot in the Old Testament, especially Ashkelon and Ashdod are mentioned a lot, even back in the days of the judges.
One of the ones they sent the rats in the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes, I don't remember which one though. But when they steal the ark and they take it to Dagon, the god of the Philistines, I think that's in Ashdod or Ashkelon, I think, or it could be in Gaza. I don't know. You put me on the spot, Grant. I don't know. It's one of those places. And so, let's see here. We talked about Pharisee dominance. And so, conclusions. Um, when you think about this time frame, territorial size and influence. And so it's the largest it has ever been in their national history. And so if I was going to ask you, at what point in history did the nation of Israel have the largest land holdings ever? If you're a good, Bible scholar, you would say Solomon, but that's not right. It's actually during the days of uh, Alexander Janus and his wife Salome, which is less than, 75 years before Jesus is born, and so this was not lost on them. Okay. So exactly 100 years after the revolt starts, everything looks perfect. I mean, you've got the pipe dream that was never going to happen. And now the Pharisees, who are considered to be like the real sincere people who really believe in the law of Moses, who are really striving to do what it says, they're in control. You've got a monarch, you got a king, you got a queen. Everything's looking great. And then within 30 years, it's all gone. Right. So you can kind of see why when Jesus is born, there's this great sense of pride, and at the same time, this great sense of shame. Great sense of pride in the fact that they had done it, and a great sense of shame that they had lost it. But also hope, because we did it before, we can do it again. We just needed the right guy. Right. And that's why in John chapter 6, half the people are like, ooh, Jesus is the guy. He's the one who can do this thing. Right. I mean, he can feed our army, he can heal those who are, injured or dead. And so, I mean, that's why the individuals are so gung ho about Jesus establishing a physical earthly kingdom, because they had done it. I mean, they had done it and they thought they could do it again. The second thing I think is corrupting power. And so it's really sad to me to see the Hasmonean dynasty turn out to be just as wicked and corrupt as any Gentile ruler, only observing religious practices, even doing so irreverently in order to maintain control on the populace. They were also prone to be incredibly cruel and intimidating to their own people. And so I think it's really sad to see Matthias and Judah and Simon and all those guys who are true believers, even guys like John Hyrcanus. I think John Hyrcanus is a true believer, who makes sacrifices in order for them to be able to, worship God according to the law of Moses and all these things. And then you look up and your grandkids, right, are just, just hellions. I mean, just heathens. I mean, just terrible individuals. And so I think that's kind of sad. And number three, this emerging Pharisee dominance, which I think is probably the most important thing when we get to the Gospels. And so in a few decades, they went from being a somewhat small and insignificant party that was being persecuted by the monarchy to being the leading religious body and arguably the leading political body in the nation. And so when you think about the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty, I mean, the rise of the Pharisees, I mean, the first time we really get any mention of the Pharisees at all, it was like maybe 25 years before this, with John Hyrcanus. And so within 25 years, they go from being a really kind of fringe group, to being, the largest religious body in Judaism. So their rise is astronomical too. Any comments or questions on tonight's class before we close?